Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I think I'm live. I don't know if I'm live on YouTube yet. Okay, now I'm live. It's a bit of a delay. So I have my headphones on now, but I may take them off. Good afternoon. I got about less than 90 minutes. What am I saying? I have about an hour and 15 minutes. This may not be the biggest stream because it's an odd period of a work day, so I understand. But nonetheless, you should be liking this stream. You should be liking the stream to boost the algorithm, sharing it wherever you can. If you're in Telegram groups, if you're in Twitter group, if you're on Twitter, if you're wherever on social media, just share this around if you are able. And then, of course, you want to subscribe to the channel if you are new and hit the notifications bell so you know when I'm going live. And lastly, yes, I have met my goal, but I am upping it to about 500 subscribers, I think, because that will help me bridge what is the exodus that is always to come at every beginning of the month on Patreon. That's unfortunately how it works. So help me get closer to 500 subscribers to help mitigate that at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. It's how you support this channel. It's how you support all of my work from the columns to the streams. So I'm just going to take on my headphones because I don't really need them. I don't think I'm playing a video today, but I'll keep them on standby. So hello. Okay. Wow, it sounds much better. Those are noise canceling headphones. So how do I sound, everyone? I'm just gonna say hello to everyone in the chat. Hello, Alex. Apple, Danny Haifong thought. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Big Teal. Hello. Hello. Appreciate it. Hello, Patamilo again. Good to see you again. All right. So that's it. The chat. We got a little bit of a small crowd. Hopefully more people end up showing up, but keep liking the stream. Make sure people see this and sharing it around. So I wanted to come on today because the latest news is that there is, for the month of June, there has been a 9.1% consumer price index, aka inflation rate. That means that prices for everything on average went up by 9% in June. That's a pretty high number. I remember when I was talking to Richard Wolff earlier this was it this month, and when I was talking to Michael Hudson even last month or at the end of May, we were talking about 8.6%. That was the estimation. But actually, June was a lot worse than even those doomsdayers in the economic world, in the economist and financial world, even what they were saying, even on the stock exchanges, etc. They were all predicting under 9%, about 8.6%, but June was 9.1%. So I think it's important to talk about it. I found a brief article on sort of how Marxists should think about economically, how they should be thinking about inflation, and we can get into that. And then I'm going to spend the second half, so I have about a little over an hour, so spend the second half talking about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. This was an act that was signed by Joe Biden at the end of December 2021, and it has gone into effect under his administration as of this month. Oh, Patamilo is still up there. So I'm just going to say hello to the new folks in the chat. Keep liking the stream. Keep hitting the notification bell. Keep subscribing to the channel. Hello, High Noon. Hello, Jojo. Hello, Jonathan. 9% pay cut for everyone. Indeed, indeed. 100% if you're unemployed, says Big Teal. Very true. Very true. All right. So keep, liking, sharing the stream, of course, and please do. If you are not a subscriber to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button and hit that notifications bell. And of course, if you can, subscribe at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong to sustain this work. So yeah, as I said, we are in a moment of crisis, of just runaway inflation. And that inflation was worse over the month of June than predicted. Of course, we find out in mid-July that it was worse than predicted. I think we all felt it. I think 8.6% sounds like a high number, right? But it was actually lower than what actually transpired. We have been going through an average of a 9% spike in prices. And while there's hope that it can be reduced, that this inflation can be reduced, a lot of the solutions, as we said yesterday, as we talked about yesterday, the solutions have been to put, as I've been saying on this channel for, it seems like over a month, they're going to put us into an economic crisis. They're going to manufacture an economic crisis just to supposedly get us out of inflation. I mean, it's that criminal. So let's go to the report then. Okay, let's start. Let's begin with this inflation crisis. Again, as I said, we're talking about 9.1% in June. That's a 40-year high, says Politico. Low income in Black and Hispanic Americans have been hit especially hard. Surprise, surprise there. So surging prices for gas, food, and rent. So this is the Associated Press. That's just Politico republisher. Surging prices for gas, food, and rent catapulted U.S. inflation to a new 4-decade peak in June, further pressuring households and likely sealing the case for another large interest rate hike by the Federal Reserve, with higher borrowing costs to follow. Consumer prices soared 9.1% compared with a year earlier. The government said Wednesday, the biggest 12-month increase since 1981, and up from an 8.6% jump in May. On a monthly basis, prices rose 1.3% from May to June, another substantial increase after prices had jumped 1% from April to May. Oh, so this is a 9.1% higher increase than last year. So prices have otherwise just been going up and up and up each and every year. I mean, each and every month. So the ongoing price increases underscore the brutal impact that inflation has inflicted on many families, with the cost of necessities in particular rising much faster than average incomes. Lower income and Black and Hispanic Americans have been especially hit hard because a disproportionate share of their income goes towards essentials such as housing, transportation, and food, aka they are poor. Some economists have held out hope that inflation might be reaching or nearing a short-term peak. Gas prices, for example, have fallen from an eye-watering $5 a gallon reached in mid-June to an average of $4.66 nationwide as of Tuesday. Still a far higher price than a year ago, but a drop that could help slow inflation for July and possibly August. In addition, shipping costs and commodity prices have begun to fall. Pay increases have slowed. And survey shows that Americans' expectations for inflation over the long run have eased, a trend that often points to more moderate price increases over time. Yet for now, the relentless spike in inflation has caused a steep drop in consumers' confidence in the economy, sent President Joe Biden's approval ratings tumbling, and posed a major political threat to Democrats in the November congressional elections. 40% of adults said in an AP NORC poll that they thought tackling inflation should be a top government priority this year, up from just 14% who said so in December. So there you have it, 9.1% increase year on year since last June. People are suffering. There was not much detail about the condition of Black people, of Latino and Latinx families. No real details about that. But I mean, that's easy to see, right? If prices are going up for everything, all they said was, well, a disproportionate amount of their income goes to housing, transportation, and food. And why would that be? Well, it's because a disproportionate number of Black and Latino families are in poverty and are in the worst forms of poverty. They're in the lowest of income brackets, the vast, unfortunately, a good number and what could constitute a majority, right? We're talking about Black wealth heading towards zero. And that's been the case for many years now. Black wealth is heading towards zero. You have millions of, especially Black people, who have had their lives ruined by mass incarceration, and they will forever be on the margins of the capitalist economy, what some used to call the lumpen proletariat. They will forever be unable to get certain jobs that can pay them enough money. They will always be in the gig economy or the low wage economy or in the so-called informal economy. I mean, that's happened to millions of people, especially in Black and Latino communities. So it's no wonder that inflation would have a real impact on them, probably the highest impact, right? So not a lot of detail about that, of course, in the corporate media. All they'll say is a disproportion of the amount of their income. Well, if you don't have any disposable income to speak of, if you're, making on average less than $20,000 per year, which a lot of people in this country do, especially Black workers in this low wage economy. Well, you're not going to have any money for anything else if you have to pay higher prices for your rent, higher prices for your gas, and higher prices for your food. I mean, you'll have nothing left over. So, of course, it's going to hit these folks particularly hard. Should come as no surprise. So, let's talk about how we should see inflation, okay? I know I've had Richard Wolff on here. I know I had Michael Hudson on here, and they talked about a Marxist perspective on inflation. I think they did a really good job making it digestible. And I just want to review some basic, when I say a Marxist perspective, now I'm talking about from Karl Marx. So let's review what Karl Marx said about inflation. I'm not going to go over Marx's texts like Value, Price, and Profit, which certainly we could do here, but it would take many episodes. But there is an article that I found. I was doing some scouring, and it's a short article in a British publication called Counterfire. This is definitely not an endorsement of Counterfire. I believe let's see what tendency Counterfire is from. Counterfire is, it's probably in the I'm sure it's in the Trotskyist sect. I don't know many other parties. Anyway, they don't say. But Counterfire this is a good article. We're going to talk about the inflation problem. This was written in 2021. It says why inflation is not caused by workers. I think that's an important thing. Of course, Richard Wolff went over this. He said employers are the one who sets prices. I mean, that's a very astute point. Yes, it's not the workers who set prices. It's the employers who set the prices. So that's one aspect of this in the class struggle. But let's see what Marx had to say. This article talks about the limits of Keynesianism. If you don't know what Keynesian, John Maynard Keynes, renowned economist, oftentimes misunderstood. We could have Radhika Desai on here. She studied Keynes really deeply. But just know that he's often attributed with the school of economic thought that favors capitalist economics, but more government spending, right? In order to curb the problems of capitalism. That's often how he's associated. I think Radhika Desai would definitely, probably expound upon that more, but that's how he is associated. So let's talk about why it's not the workers' fault that this inflation is happening, because it's all being put on us. It always is under neoliberal capitalism. It's always our fault. It's always the fault of working class people. Working class people are the reasons why prices are going up. You heard it very early on. Do you remember this? Do you remember when, this wasn't that long ago, when we were told that our mass quitting was the problem, that we were demanding too much, that employers now had to give up more, give higher salaries just to hire people because of the pandemic. It was like it was our fault that the jobs were shitty, the pandemic was raging. It's like it's not our fault that was happening. It's the fault of the government for neglecting us and not taking care of our needs during a pandemic. And two, it's the fault of employers for paying such shitty wages. If you want people to work during a pandemic, you're going to have to incentivize it. And that didn't happen. So people quit in the millions, and we were initially blamed for this inflation problem early on. We were considered a factor. And then there was all the other ridiculous before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? You probably remember being told that it was China's COVID-19 response. Oh no, the supply chains are being disrupted and prices are going up because of China's COVID-19 response. China had literally had that COVID-19 response since January of 2020. And we're being told, oh, it's China's fault. Ridiculous. So let's talk about why inflation is not the fault of rising wages. And this article does a good job. It says for decades, inflation has tended to hover at a low level in developed economies, but in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's rising. Some economists view this as a temporary bounce, while there are those who suspect this may be more long term, and even that 1970 style stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and low growth, may be in prospect, which seems like what's happening. This was in 2021. They were just pontificating. Now we know we're in July of 2022, and we know that the inflation problem has not improved. It's gotten worse. Whoever is right, mainstream economic commentary will warn that workers must not demand wage rises to maintain their standard of living, as will fuel inflation. Therefore, whether it is a short-term blip or a long-term problem, the working class will be expected to bear the burden of the problem, not capital. The current problem of rising prices is not a problem created by labor. Rather, it is to do with the behavior of capital in the last decades. In general, capitalism has sought to transfer production to low-wage economies in order to boost profits. Thereby, long and vulnerable supply chains were created. In countries like Britain, the emphasis has been on forcing down average wages through flexibility and so on, rather than investing in equipment which would make labor more productive, a course which would allow for higher wages. Instead, we have an economy based around low wage, insecure employment, and one which has become dependent upon migrant labor in many areas, from food harvesting to road haulage to hospitality. The shortage of drivers at the moment is unlikely to be eased quickly because working conditions here are so poor. So this is UK based. So we're talking about Britain. And this sounds like the United States, right? High use of migrant labor, the refusal to pay higher wages for productive labor, and instead doing everything you can to get that to make that labor more precarious through offshoring and not investing in the technology needed to expand production, rather by increasing the rate of exploitation and only investing in technology when it does so, leading to problems. So the result will be rising prices because of shortages, and that's not the fault of labor. Other areas of cost cutting, such as the energy sector, where gas storage facilities have been scrapped, are also sources of exposure to price shocks. These are all the results of economic strategies which maximize profit at the expense of workers, infrastructure, and the social fabric more generally. So here it is, the wage inflation spiral ploy. I mean, you've heard this, right? The wage price spiral. The wage price spiral. That's what we're told is the problem here. It's the wage price spiral. Wages go up, prices go up. It's a spiral, and it keeps going and going and going. Then the prices go up, and then the wages maybe don't go. I mean, we're seeing that this is a ridiculous. It's a myth. There's no wage price spiral. But here we go. Inflationary pressures right now can be shown to be the result of neoliberal economic strategy. But even if that were to be conceded, a standard orthodox line would be that workers still must show restraint in their wage demands, or a wage price spiral will be the result. In this view, when workers win wage rises or wage increases, companies simply pass on the cost through price hikes, meaning that other employees are forced to follow suit and prices go up generally. This logic has been fashioned into an anti-trade union argument that workers would actually be better off if they didn't fight for higher wages, since they would lose out through the resultant inflation anyway. So you can't win, just lose. That's what the bosses are telling us. That argument, of course, is nonsense, since employers press wages down even further when there is weak resistance. It also ignores the historical fact that labor has generally been in a position to try to catch up with inflation rather than workers' action being the force that drives it. Inflation during the 1970s followed a period of declining profitability, and trade union actions were essentially defensive, attempting to maintain the standards of living that had been achieved in the post-war decades. The stagflation of the 1970s also undermined one of the key economic theories of inflation in the form of the Keynesian explanation that once an economy has reached full employment, thus with strong aggregate demand, then wages would be pushed up because workers had greater bargaining power. When there is little slack in the economy, then the result is inflation. This theory broke down in the conditions of stagflation because it was a period of low growth and rising unemployment, and yet inflation surged. Conversely, the generally low inflation of the last 2 decades was accompanied by relatively modest levels of unemployment. While economists still hold that there is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, the connection is at the least weak and strongly affected by other economic factors. So here you have the author saying that Keynesianism is kind of incorrect here, that you can't just get full employment and that somehow is going to influence inflation for the benefit. You had modest levels of unemployment with little inflation, right? So there is very little connection. It also ignores the fact that workers resist. They're the strongest when they resist. And it leaves everything up to the employers, what they do, what corporations do. So we're talking about austerity here. I mean, that's what really underpins all of this, and this article gets into it. So another major orthodox explanation for inflation is the monetarist one, which rose to prominence in the wake of the breakdown of Keynesian economic strategies in the 1970s. Monetarism underpinned the neoliberal economic policies of the succeeding period. The argument was that money supply was the causal force of inflation. If there was too much money relative to goods, inflation would rise, so governments and central banks should restrict the supply of money to bring prices under control. Like the Keynesian argument, it fundamentally relies on a simple theory of supply and demand, but just locates the crucial variables in a different aspect of the economy. Instead of employment, we're talking about money supply. The monetarist thesis is also broken down in the wake of recent experience. Despite conditions which should fuel inflation, especially with huge injections in the money supply from the central bank's policy of quantitative easing since 2008, together with historically low interest rates, inflation has failed to spike. It's important to note here that the monetarist theory has malign consequences for workers, just as the Keynesian argument does. The strict control of money supply means that governments are limited in the debt they can accrue in order to fund spending, whether on infrastructure development or social services. So here, I mean, this is quite obvious. We're being told that, oh, it's the money supply, it's the money. You're spending too much money. How many times have we heard it's COVID-19 stimulus, COVID-19, too much money, too much stimulus? But no real talk about where did that money go? A lot of the money went to the top. A lot of that, just like in 2007, 2008, a lot of it went to the top. The 1% ran away with it. The Fed basically pumped tens of billions of dollars per month into the biggest banks responsible for the crisis in 2008. And then you saw all of the measures from the PPP loans to the direct stimulus just go right into the hands of the 1%. So two massive wealth transfers, right? I think it was 4 trillion during the economic crisis, and we know several trillion during this last huge injection of just straight cash into the richest people, into the capitalists. So the theory, therefore, leads directly toward austerity, which drives down standard of living. It also dovetails with policies of privatization and cost cutting, which, as noted above, underlie many of the problems we are facing now. If monetarism is correct in the first place, then a major justification for neoliberal austerity is blown out of the water. Moreover, rather than being necessary to control inflation, the policy consequences actively created the conditions for its rise in our current circumstances. In fact, it is increasingly admitted that mainstream economics just doesn't understand the causes of inflation very well at all. A member of the executive board of the European Central Bank has said that, quote, economics is indeed struggling with inflation theory. Monetary aggregates and monetarism has been correctly abandoned. Domestic slack explanation, the Phillips curve, i.e. the Keynesian argument, have been under attack, but are still a bit alive. On the other side of the Atlantic, and more circumspectly, the former chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve admitted our framework for understanding inflation dynamics could be misspelled in some fundamental way. These are quite remarkable statements from the vacuity of orthodox analysis. So now we're going to get into the heart of the matter. Do wage rises lead to price rises? So if we get paid more per hour, do we have to pay more wherever we are purchasing things, right? Do we have to pay more for the commodities that our labor produces or that labor produces? The argument about inflation will likely, despite all that, still boil down to contention that wage rises fuel inflation. Marx disposed of this all the way back in 1865 in the piece later published in English as Value, Price, and Profit. To begin with, he takes the assumption of bourgeois economics and works through his own logic. Within these limits, he points out that in consequence of a rise in wages, there would be a simple linear impact upon prices in general. There would not be a simple linear impact on prices in general. Rather, since the effect would be on specific commodities, this would work its way throughout the whole system to the point that, quote, the general rise in the rates of wages would, therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit, without any permanent change in the price of commodities. This is a bounded and hypothetical exercise, but Marx uses it to show that the simple laws such as the wage rises lead to inflation equation don't hold true, even according to their own logic. Marx doesn't just rely on abstract reasoning, but points out to historical experience. For example, the impact of the 10 Hours Act of 1848, which had been vigorously opposed by economists and capitalists. The result was a shortening of the work day, an increase in wages, a rise in productivity, and a fall in the prices of products altogether. He quotes one economist as admitting that the, quote, and all other official propounders of economic science had been wrong, while the instinct of the people had been right. So there you have it. And there was a point in history, Marx referenced, and I remember that. I've read Value, Price, and Profit, where he talks about how the workday had been reduced to 10 hours and the resultant market price shock evened itself out because it followed that the laws of competition would require that, and that the rise in productivity and the rise in wages would not necessarily lead to a rise in prices. It would lead to a fall in the rate of profit, though, which is important. We should know that wages, when they rise, it does because, and this is the whole point of Marxism, to understand where profit comes from. That yes, if you make more money, you are surely going to eat into the profits of the capitalists. And this is an important point. I just want to make this one last point before continuing. Do not listen to those leftists and liberals who tell you, because this is wrong, that because there are record profits, wage rises wouldn't lead to losses in profit, because that just skirts the source of profiteering. You have to understand how profit is made under capitalism. If you fully misunderstand it and say, well, there's just all this money there anyway. Look at Amazon, billions of dollars. If Amazon were to raise its wages, let's say from $15 an hour minimum to $35 an hour minimum, damn right they would lose profits. If the super profits would be cut into. And that's because a lot of their profits are accumulated off of the unpaid labor time that is imposed upon workers. So yes, we should point out that record profits indicate that there's a higher rate of exploitation, but we shouldn't say that somehow that doesn't mean that profits won't fall if wages increase. With the way that wages need to increase, if we were to do that across the capitalist system, there would be massive profit losses and it would send shockwaves throughout the capitalist system. This isn't a defense of the bosses. This is just a reality. If you raise wages to a certain degree, profits will indeed be cut into. And that's not to say that you can't have higher wages and higher profits. We've had other periods where that is the case, and that is the true sense of the truth of things. But there's also, I think, we can get even further down kind of a Marxian economic rabbit hole, where the more developed and advanced the system becomes, the more costly it becomes to reproduce it. And the more likely, which is what has happened, more likely capitalists are going to try to squeeze everything out of labor in order to compete with all of the advances that are happening and all of the concentration of capital that is happening across the system. So there are multiple things to consider, but the point is we shouldn't say it's not truth. We can't predict that profits are just going to be so sky high. This is just like a kind of like I think a liberal error to just pray, oh, well, there's so much money in the system. It's floating around. Look at all the profits that Amazon makes. Look at all these big monopolies making all this money. If we just pay workers more, everything will be copacetic. No, this is class struggle. This is not class cooperation. There's no such thing. So that's why we need to understand that there's a lot more to this. So toward the conclusion of Value, Price, and Profit, Marx is able to reach a conclusion that is very relevant to arguments about inflation and indeed anticipates the experience of workers during the 1970s stagflation. Quote, in all cases I've considered, and they form 99 out of 100, you have seen that struggle for a rise of wages follows only in the track of previous changes and is a necessary offspring of previous changes in the amount of production, the productive powers of labor, the value of labor, the value of money, the extent or the intensity of labor extracted, the fluctuation of market prices, dependent upon the fluctuations of supply and demand, and consistent with the different phases of the industrial cycle in one word, as reactions of labor against the previous actions of capital. By treating the struggle for a rise of wages independently of all these circumstances, by looking only upon the change of wages and overlooking all other changes from which they emanate, you proceed from a false premise in order to arrive at false conclusions. So basically what I was saying, look at how many factors are involved. Look how many factors are involved when wages rise. Look at all of these components, right? And it's so important to understand a demand for a wage increase as part of a reaction to the actions of capital. And there is an offspring, right? There are things we have to consider across the system, all of the value of all of this, the understanding of all of this. It's not just, right, that wages will lead to price increases, that you can't, that you know, it's like this completely parallel relationship. When we make more money, they take more money, is what Marx is combating here. And so one lesson of the failures of economic theory and the widely differing historical patterns of inflation is that the number of factors involved in their complex interaction make any simple causal equation for inflation invalid. Blaming wage rises is therefore an empty exercise in class war propaganda. Certainly, inflation is a flashpoint for class struggle. Employers, on average, in any favorable circumstance, will try to suppress wages, and workers must act continuously to defend wage rates and push them higher whenever possible. The result, if they don't do this, as Marx pointed out, would be that wages fall behind their average value across the whole economic cycle. Wage rates would thus be dispossessed in the long term, reaching lower levels in boom periods than would otherwise be the case. Yet, as is the case of the 1848 10 Hours Act proved, higher wages by no means preclude capitalist prosperity, while the reverse often does prove to be true. Inflation is a wedge issue. It is a simple way for the ruling class to drive down wages and conditions. Keynes himself suggested inflation was a useful way to raise profit levels since it was easier than directly cutting wages. Capitalism is a complex and unstable system built around a series of contradictory forces. A fundamental one is the clash in interest between labor and capital, workers and employers. Whatever the causes of inflation in a given historical situation, the working class needs to resist the pressure from above to rescue the system by sacrificing their own standard of living. The instinct of the people to demand higher wages in response to inflation is the correct one. So there you have it. I mean, that was a good piece, basically saying, look at all the factors involved that influence the change in prices, most of which have to do with the ownership of capital by capitalists and how capitalists wield that capital in order to reproduce more capital and in order to make more profit. And that's what's happening in this inflation crisis. And we know that historically, in this moment, as the article suggested, there are context-specific factors. The Russia special military operation is a big one. We already see the euro, as I said yesterday, has plunged to parity, if not below, the value of the US dollar. So parity with or below that of the US dollar, the value. And we know that we have countries now preparing. I think Hungary is now preparing a state of emergency because of energy shortages. This is going to happen all across Europe because of how Europe has shot itself in the foot with these economic sanctions and refuses to do anything that the United States doesn't tell it. So it refuses to go against the United States. It refuses to do anything unless the United States tells it to do so when it comes to this issue. And the United States is winning in that way. It is really defeating Europe in a lot of ways. And the economic crisis is going to be, it's coming. The interest rate spikes are going to continue to come. And I want to just show you one more quick thing. We already know so this is the lever. This is David Sirota's. I want to also say Ben Norton covered this as well. Jerome Powell in May, I'm not going to read this whole article. I'm just going to go. Powell said that his goal was to get wages down at a May 4th press conference. And when he announced the interest rate hike of a half a percentage point, which is the largest since 2000. So back in May when he did that, he thought it would limit businesses' hiring demand and lead to suppressed wages. So basically instituting a recession. If you can't borrow more, this is the secret of capitalism right now. Capital is in debt to itself, honestly. Its rate of exploitation is so high that it has incurred its own level of enormous corporate debt. So when you raise interest levels, you're really stymieing any kind of investment, meaning fewer jobs, meaning reducing hiring demand, meaning here comes an economic crisis. So that would get us a chance to get inflation down, wages down, and then get inflation down without having to slow the economy and have a recession and have unemployment rise materially. Well, now we know that's not true, that these interest rate hikes aren't enough, but they're going to take them even further because they don't want to do what is sensible, which is reintegrate the world economy with Russia, which is to stop this suicidal path of isolating Europe from Russia and in part China. They don't want to do any of that. They don't want to do any of the basic things also in containing the wage price so-called spiral and containing the inflation. Maybe you have price freezes, maybe you have wage freezes, or maybe, just maybe, you stimulate the economy in a way that doesn't favor the business class, the corporate ruling class, the capitalist class. That would be the socialist response. But I digress. The only capitalist response would be to do as Richard Wolff had said in the past, where there were wage price freezes and there was a fundamental focus on trying to meet the interests of all stakeholders when getting the prices of commodities down. So there you have it. You have the Federal Reserve saying, yeah, we're going to attack workers in order to get inflation down. And we already know that to be true because the recession is coming. So this has followed a path that, if you understand inflation from a Marxist perspective, is really all about capital intensifying its assault on labor. Capital is intensifying its exploitation of labor, its exploitation of workers. And so that's why inflation was even higher than what was predicted, is because the capitalists, they went for the gusto. They intensified exploitation to an even higher amount. So I'm going to move on because I have about 30 more minutes, and I want to talk about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is not unrelated to to all of this. Okay. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was passed December 2021 by the Biden administration. It was unanimous. Like, again, it's one of these instances where there is no difference between Democrats or Republicans on the question of imperialism, on the question of aggression toward China. There was no resistance to this bill. Actually, this bill was framed as some kind of social justice thing. Like, oh, look at those poor Uyghurs in China. We need to come together and punish these big bad companies for doing business. And how do they do it? Well, they place sanctions on China. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, I'm going to pull up. First, I'm going to show you just quickly an article on a business journal, which has the ruling class perspective. Okay. And then I'm going to show you what China's saying from the Global Times. So here you have the National Center for Business Journalism. This is I mean, look at this guy. Not our friend, certainly, but he's just talking about how the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act will affect trade between the U.S. and China. So just going over kind of the basics of it. And so he says, this is the worst part. Global human rights advocates got an early Christmas gift when Joe Biden signed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act into law, introduced by Marco Rubio and Jim McGovern. So you have Apple, Nike, Amazon, General Motors, Coca-Cola, Heinz, among other brand names, do business in Xinjiang. And this is all to ban any products that come out of Xinjiang. How you enforce such a thing? Hard to say. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of errors. That's why this is very related to the inflation question, because it's almost unenforceable, since Xinjiang is If you know anything about production, Xinjiang is actually producing more so the parts and the pieces. Xinjiang isn't. You're not importing iPhones from the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Now, China certainly has increased the value of the goods that it exports abroad, but in Xinjiang, believe me, they're producing the polysilicon for the solar panels, but they're not exporting the solar panels. So you see how complicated this gets? This is a complete misunderstanding of the very supply chains they're always crying about. But anyway, so according to the State Department, of course, the best source you should use, the People's Republic of China has carried out internment, forced labor, and genocide in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Those allegations and blah, 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 the Olympics. And so I want to get to, so it says the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act goes beyond condemnation of forced labor practices. It gives the U.S. Customs and Border Protection the right to seize any goods made in Xinjiang and force companies to prove that forced labor was not involved in the manufacturing of those goods, effectively amounting to an import ban. After Biden signed the act into law, international law firm Sidney Austin LLP quickly labeled it a game changer that will dramatically affect how companies conduct business in Xinjiang, which has become a global supply chain hub where several international corporations conduct business. Companies should prepare for aggressive enforcement. The legislation comes on the heels of 11 withhold release orders issued by the CBP over the last 2 years on products from Xinjiang. So this is just straight up anti-China. It's going to backfire. It already has, and that's what China has been saying. But so this is what's happening. They're holding. Look at that, Australia strategic policy. So they're withholding products. They're discriminating on products. They're saying products made in Xinjiang can't come here because of forced labor, supposedly. And then there's been some opposition, but look at who they're citing. It's the State Department, now the ASPI, which is funded by the Department of Defense. So published in March 2020, detailed all these atrocities, despite the fact that they're funded by the Department of Defense. Apple and Nike were also reportedly two of the most high-profile opponents of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act before its passage. They claimed it would be a detrimental impact on their supply chains, according to WAPO and New York Times. Spokespersons from both of the companies issued comments to those papers condemning the general practice of forced labor manufacturing, but defending their stances. Apple said that it had issue with the legislation was purely about the logistics of its enforcement, while Nike denied ever actually opposing the bill. Both corporations maintain their self-audits of their own supply chains had turned up no evidence of forced labor. I mean, let's be honest. These corporations are super exploiting labor. But the question is it in Xinjiang? And is China really spurring it? That's a question here. So here you have the AFL-CIO acting as the good agents of the State Department they usually are. What Apple would like is that we all just sit and talk and have no real consequences. They're shocked. It's the first time there could be some effective accountability. So you have the AFL-CIO jumping on the anti-China bandwagon as usual. They believe that China is against their interests because they think that China is the reason why their labor conditions are down. Of course, that's not the case. They're not looking at the fact that their own employers and their own corporations are committing real crimes of super exploitation. They don't look at that. They're looking at China. And that's why the AFL-CIO is doing absolutely nothing to improve the condition of working class people in the United States. They're too focused on what the national security state is doing. So some global trade experts expressed concerns in a Political report that the aggressive enforcement could have detrimental effect on companies' ability to import widely used goods into the U.S. while doing very little to alleviate the conditions of those imprisoned and forced to manufacture those goods against their will. If all of U.S. business withdraws from Xinjiang, Uyghurs that are currently being exploited there are going to be driven into poverty. There's going to be a potential humanitarian crisis. Saying the quiet part out loud there. Yes, if you withdraw investment without any kind of alternative, and now this, of course, takes away China's agency completely. So China's not even a factor here. But it goes to say that if you conduct, it's a sanctions regime. So a sanctions regime is meant to starve people, and that's what that's what it could do. I don't believe it's doing that because I believe China is taking care of things, but nonetheless. So there are some enforcement issues. Okay, so it's hard to know how to do this. It says they haven't. They have a task force until mid-June to come up with an enforcement plan. So they're acting that out. This is an old article. So we're talking about Now that enforcement plan is coming out. It's hard to know how they're enforcing it. There's not a lot of transparency on this. But Zhao Lijian, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry in China, said by cooking up lies and making troubles on such issues, U.S. politicians are seeking to contain China and hold back China's development through economic bullying and political manipulation in the name of human rights. We could say that the damage from this could be 64 million in imports directly from Xinjiang and as much as 119 billion in imports from China as a whole. So that's a big possible loss. And I mean, think about this. In the midst of inflation, you're talking about trying to cut off one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the most prosperous countries in the world, whose Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region produces really important things. Polysilicon for solar panels, for example. A lot of the parts made for technology also made in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is not the highest value commodity producer, but it's a key cog in the supply chain at this point. So that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It's a total import ban. And so I want to get into, so we have the time, I want to get into what the Global Times has to say about this and then a few statistics, okay? I wanted to also comment on the UN. I don't think I'll have time for that. But let's see what the Global Times has to say about it. Let's see what the different perspective is. So this was written in June 22nd because that's when this ban came into effect, or that's when the enforcement started this June. So American businesses in China say they fear, so it's called U.S. law banning Xinjiang products is malicious to backfire on American firms. And they say American businesses in China say they fear the U.S.'s so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that went into effect Tuesday will interrupt shipments and raise their costs. That is next to impossible for U.S. importers to prove a negative to the law's rebuttal presumption of forced labor, according to the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday. With surging inflation in the U.S., the U.S. law banning Xinjiang-produced goods with a fabricated accusation is likely to increase real costs for American firms. That cost rise will be translated to many consumer goods in the U.S. supermarkets, resulting in worsening inflation and causing the U.S. economy to slip into recession. Like the U.S. government's series of economic coercive measures in the past, Washington's latest legislation of Xinjiang products is set to backfire on American businesses and the U.S.'s own economy. The U.S.'s new law has shifted the burden of proving a lie from the U.S. customs to its companies. The change will cast a pall on U.S. importers' business and will impact electronics, agricultural goods, and other products. Considering the gray area and practice, the law may be used by the U.S. government as a weapon to stifle selected industries and enterprises from China. The U.S. government analysts sees the legislation as part of a broader campaign to decouple from the Chinese economy, but the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act will fail to stifle Chinese industries or exclude China from global industrial chains, as bilateral trade with China is complicated and highly integrated. Take cotton, the first U.S. target of the ban from the Xinjiang region, as an example. The U.S. has banned all products from containing cotton from Xinjiang from early last year. The ban has exacerbated global supply chain problems for cotton products, pushing up cotton prices to almost double from the 2020 levels, clobbering the downstream textile industries in Asia, and also to the detriment of the U.S.'s own effort to curb inflation. If the U.S. attempts to use the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to suppress Xinjiang's photovoltaic industry and suppress the region's economic growth, the U.S. is going to be disappointed. Earlier this month, the Biden administration was forced to exempt solar components from 4 Southeast Asian countries from import duties for 2 years in order to solve the U.S.'s solar industry supply woes. But nearly 50% of the world's polysilicon, the main raw material for the photovoltaic industry, comes from Xinjiang. The U.S. simply cannot curb Xinjiang's photovoltaic industry by restricting imports. In fact, the U.S.'s reckless decoupling move is partly the reason that U.S. inflation has become so entrenched in its economic system. Over a year into U.S. President Joe Biden's first term, the U.S. is still fighting former President Donald Trump's trade war. The Biden administration also placed many Chinese companies on its so-called entity ban list, which constrained Chinese enterprises' growth, but also backfired on U.S.'s manufacturing. The supply shortage of semiconductors and other industrial materials caused by Biden's decoupling moves has led to prices of auto vehicles and a range of electronic devices in the U.S. market. So price rises happening in those areas. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act violates the laws of the market economy, undermining market rules that have been effectively formed in the global industrial chain. Washington, with this poisonous Xinjiang law, is meddling in the global value chain for political manipulation. It will fail and be rejected by the market. So that's just real politics. That's just saying, and this is true, by cutting Xinjiang, China is so Xinjiang in specifically, but China in particular is so integrated in the global economy that it's not a fully capitalist economy, but it operates within this larger market-based system. And to try to cut it off at any level, even small ones. But now we're saying, the trade war was a pretty big deal. It's still happening. That there's still many tariffs on Chinese goods and trade, which are hurting American corporations, U.S. corporations. Now to put sanctions like this onto China and onto Xinjiang is now only adding to the pain. So with electronics, with the solar industry, I mean, you're talking about very important pieces to the development of these products, leading to, and I thought this was interesting, leads to increase in prices for cotton products, for automobiles, all of it, renewables, all of it, it goes up. And the US government does nothing about that, right? So you have really an out of control situation, economic warfare blowing back. And so that's what the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is doing. Okay? That's what the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is doing. It is blowing back. Now, we have to get to the accusations. What does China say about the allegations? Let's just look at a few short reviews of a study or two, what China is saying. And then maybe I'll table Michelle Bachelet's trip for another stream because it was an important trip. But there's only one key point in it that is relevant here. But I want to show you what China has said, okay? What has China said about this, about these allegations, all right? Let's start with what China said about the cotton farmers, right? Cotton farmers are being exploited and oppressed. Well, let's see. Let's be the judge of that. What does China say? Do you believe them? This was actually published recently. So, no, actually, this was published last year because these allegations were happening mostly last year. So last year in October, they reported that cotton farmers and Xinjiang officials refute forced labor myth. So, Urumqi. So, Shayar County in northwest China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region on Friday held a press conference at which cotton farmers, and local officials refuted the myth of forced labor in Xinjiang fabricated by Western anti-China forces. According to Aksu Prefecture official Niyaz Aksim, Aksu is one of the largest cotton-producing areas in Xinjiang with a cotton planting area of 500,000 hectares. Its output of long staple cotton accounts for more than 90% of China's total. In 2020, the textile garment industry in Aksu created 102,000 jobs, bringing workers an average monthly income of 3,600 to 5,000 RMB or yuan, about 559 to 777 US dollars per month. Local government departments protect the rights of workers in the cotton industry, and textile garment enterprises sign labor contracts with employees according to the law, Niaz Axim noted. All ethnic groups receive equal pay for equal work. They enjoy social insurance, training, vacation time, and other legitimate labor rights. The enterprises fully respect the religious beliefs, customs, languages, and other rights of ethnic minority employees, said Axim. Muta Roman, a local cotton farmer, became a cotton picking machine driver 2 years ago. He said he can earn more than 100,000 RMB per year. He is now teaching his brother and apprentices maintenance techniques and how to drive cotton pickers and tractors. I believe when they master the skills, they will earn more money like me. Muhar Roman said that I saw online that some anti-China forces made up the forced labor accusations against Xinjiang, which are pure slander. I rely on technology and diligence to make a living. How could that be forced labor? So that's their perspective, okay? That's a lot of money. So you see the element, as I said, on Twitter, labor on the cotton farms in Xinjiang is mainly mechanized. So it's workers, it's not a lot of labor, but those who are working the labor are working machines. That's what you saw in that press conference. They're working machines. 100,000 RMB in China per year. It's good money. I would say that you're living a comfortable lifestyle. You're living pretty comfortably. You have money to spend, so you have some disposable income after meeting basic needs. So that doesn't sound like forced labor. But there was also a study, and I'll also pull up the Xinhua report on that. There was also a study conducted by scholars in Xinjiang about this forced labor claim. So, two scholars from northwest China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region debunked the forced labor claims about Uyghur workers in a recent interview with Xinhua. So, this was April 8th. So, it's a little bit before, about 6 months before. So, Nilufu Gayret and Chen Ning both visiting research fellows at Jinan University in China's Guangdong province, published a report in March after conducting field research among 70 ethnic minority workers from 5 companies, shedding light on the Xinjiang ethnic minority workers' employment in the province. The report found that the top 3 reasons for the interviewees to work in Guangdong are the lure of high income, introduction from family members and friends, and good natural and social environment. The respondents opting for these reasons account for 36%, 24%, and 15% of the total, respectively. No matter what the reason, all of them are coming to work in Guangdong out of their free will, said Nilufer Gayret, a Uyghur herself, debunking the false claims that they are forced to work in the factories. They can go out freely whenever they want, and if they don't want to work in this company, they can change to another one or go back to their hometown in Xinjiang, she said. Nilufer Gayret also noted that their report found that workers' rights to participate in religious practices and other activities are guaranteed. During the working days, they can also practice their religious beliefs, she said. The Xinjiang workers have the same rights as their colleagues from the Han ethnic group in terms of wages, and they earn about 4,500 yuan, or about 688 US dollars, to 5,500 yuan a month, according to the report. Chen said their research also found that the workers have lived happily in Guangdong, as many of them found better educational resources for their kids, improved their work skills, or saved enough to start a business in their hometown. As natives of Xinjiang, we don't want to see such lies spread on the internet and have adverse effects, said Nilufer Gayret. We want more people to know the real situation of these workers and how they work and live. It is their right to pursue a better life through hard work, and it is so normal all over the world, she added. So that's it. These are very short reports, but I think, right, the idea is clear that there is no forced labor. I mean, the whole idea, first of all, that a capitalist and imperialist system like the United States can talk about forced labor is ridiculous. The United States, built off the backs of the enslavement of Africans. The foundation of this is the enslavement of Africans. Then you talk about, over the years, the amount of super exploitation from slavery all the way into the low wage economy into today, thinking about all of the ways in which people are forced and coerced to work harder, work for more hours just to meet ends. Is that not forced labor? Capitalism is in itself forced labor. It just is veiled in the idea of free labor, right? So capitalism is another iteration of the development of private property, where people have to sell their labor to make a wage so they can eat and live. The freedom is that you can do that ostensibly where you want, however you can, right? That's the freedom. Unlike the feudal system, tied to land, tied to hereditary or aristocracies, etc., or under slavery systems from an ancient period, a more underdeveloped period of history where you had entire societies, right, run by essentially free labor that wasn't compensated. But the capitalist system in the United States was built off of slavery under capitalism, which required racism. And then forced labor continued from the child labor of the Industrial Revolution and now into today, where you have prisoners working for nothing. Prisoners are working for nothing. I wrote an article in the Global Times about this, right? And maybe I'll pull that up, because I think it's important to understand that the forced labor accusations are nothing but imperialist projection, because you have corporations in the United States, US corporations, benefiting mightily from prison labor. And here's my piece on it. I'll just go over it quickly. I wrote this July 3rd, the day before July 4th, or it was published July 3rd, the day before. So I said that they're starting to enforce this act, and it's really the most widespread economic sanctions package against China. And I said, this is a clear act of imperial projection. The American Civil Liberties Union has found that U.S. prisoners produce more than $11 billion in profits and services annually, despite workers, or I call them prisoners, they're slaves, they're only making 13 cents to 52 cents an hour on average, with 7 states paying no compensation at all. And prisoners cite that they are punished in the form of solitary confinement or having their family visitation removed on a routine basis if they refuse to do work. They refuse to work for these corporations. The U.S. Constitution, I said, it's not coincidental. Involuntary servitude in slavery is actually sanctioned as a form of criminal punishment under the 13th Amendment. And you have 1.2 million people serving sentences in state and federal prisons, not to mention nearly another million in local jails and etc. But 2/3 of this number is engaged in some kind of labor. So you have a lot of forced labor happening in the United States. In ethnic and racial minorities, people of oppressed nations in the United States are the vast majority of people in U.S. prisons, about 70%, 40% of which are Black people. That's a lot of Black people being forced to work for nothing in prison. So everything that the U.S. has alleged of China in relation to forced labor is a routine policy in U.S. prisons, and it's nothing new. We know that China is called authoritarian, despite the United States possessing 25% of the world's prisoners. We know that China is called aggressive in the South China Sea, even though the United States spends more on its military than the next 11 countries combined. So these have consequences. This has consequences. These are widespread sanctions, as I said, and it'll worsen climate change, because solar power, solar panels, these things are becoming more costly. There will be less investment happening in them because of this. Joe Biden already had a ban on specific solar producers in Xinjiang. Now, this is only going to worsen the situation. We know there's a consensus on the anti-China blitz, the new Cold War blitz, and it's reckless. And this is only fanning the flames of hostility. And I say that imperial projection, this projection, right, of the forced labor myth, it's serving two key functions for the U.S. foreign policy establishment. It's creating a convenient scapegoat in China for domestic ills, and it's also ensuring that this deepening crisis of legitimacy allows this scapegoat to kind of live in the minds of people, that this only strengthens the scapegoat. But also, right, this is the second point, it's a catalyst for the narrow interests of war profiteers. If you can have an aggressive policy, an economic policy to complement a military policy, you can build a consensus among the people. You can show that this is humanitarian, right? That's what they're trying to say. That's how they're trying to win people over, that this is humanitarian sanctions against China. And this will only help boost the military contractors, who can then say, yeah, Xinjiang is a problem. Yeah, China's a threat. We can invest more weapons to fight it. So, I just say the United States is in dire need of a course correction. It's made clear that China wants cooperation. They've made that clear. They want to walk toward their own socialist development path, along their own socialist development path. They want common prosperity, world peace. And so instead of this path of war, the United States should be, can't say we, because we're not our government, we're not the ruling class, but the United States should be addressing the economic and social ills that are already tearing apart its own society. And that would mean trading in these narrow elite interests for the good of humanity. And I said quite point blank, no such political leadership exists at this time in the United States. That is the real issue here. This is all about politics. This is a political problem, and no such leadership exists to oppose this. I don't remember anybody in Congress between the two parties opposing this, not even from the corporate side. You have these corporations alone politically. These corporations are just trying to make their money. I'm not defending Nike's practices, Amazon's, Apple's practices anywhere, but they're just trying to make their money. And the way they make their money is through these complex supply chains, which allows them to cut costs in certain areas. And China is so integrated into this that to cut them off from that is only going to make their business that much harder to conduct. And it's also going to send shockwaves, as it has, in the U.S. economy, the U.S. capitalist economy. So there's only political interests here to meet. And then, of course, as I said, the military-industrial complex really does benefit from this, because it's a military-industrial complex which gets to say, yes, these coercive measures, these economic coercive measures, only help us legitimize what we want to do, which is to militarily encircle China, which is to contain China, and which is to use these so-called human rights issues as a weapon to increase and escalate these tensions, because the United States has nothing really else to stand upon. The human rights issue is so laughable, but yet it's all that it has left to stand upon in terms of the propaganda. It can't say really anything else. It's trying to find a moral high ground on top of all the bodies that it stands upon, on top of all the exploitation, all the brutal violence that it stands upon. And that's a huge piece to this. That's a huge part of all of this. And so that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Is counterproductive just to even the establishment. It absolutely benefits nobody. It doesn't benefit us. It's based on lies. It's based on something that can't even be proven by the corporations that are being sanctioned. So essentially, it's just broad sanctions. And the premise is ridiculous. There are plenty of places in the world, the United States included, the ACLU found out, where we can prove forced labor, where we can prove virtually slave labor. That happens, and there are countries that have that. I mean, there are certain countries around the world that like just outlawed that. The United States says it outlawed it, but has been practicing it in its prisons for years and years and years. And we can prove all of that. With China, it's always, you can't never prove anything, because supposedly China is the most closed country. Well, I'll just end with this. I'm not going to read her whole statement, maybe for another time. But I'm going to show you something. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights at the United Nations, she went. She traveled all across Xinjiang. Here it is. Here's her statement. Michelle Bachelet. She went. They hated it. The State Department was so furious. She was critical in it. I looked up forced. And the reason why I looked up forced, because I want to just make a point here. Because we're not going to read the whole statement, because I got to go soon. Maybe for another time, we can go through all of the things that she said. But man, the Department of State was angry. They preempted this whole thing. They were like, we got to get someone there. We have to hold them accountable. And then when the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights goes, she wasn't investigating. She was just going, talking, getting a lay of the land, kind of, doing the diplomatic thing. But really, it was pressured for her to go. So she goes after the propaganda blitz. She writes this report, which is highly critical of China in many areas. I think it's less unfair than I expected. But there's nowhere about forced labor or genocide. So I looked up forced labor, and this is the only thing you find. China's recent ratification of the two International Labor Conventions, 29 and 105, on forced labor, once deposited, will be welcome and an important starting point for protecting fundamental principles and rights at work. It will now be important for a broad-based system encompassing not only labor inspection and enforcement, but prevention and due diligence. Business, trade unions, NGOs, and the media have an important role to monitor compliance and highlight gaps. I encourage China to engage constructively with the ILO. So there's not much there, but there's nothing on forced labor. Nothing. No, I found forced labor. No, oh, here's where forced labor is practiced. No, and this is a whole statement about about her trip, her official visit to China, which included going all over. Look at this. I type in genocide. Nothing about genocide. No genocide, no forced labor. And that's the statement by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. She's not a progressive. She's not a radical. She's not a leftist. She's not pro China. She wasn't doing China any favors. If we were to read this whole statement, which I have, you'll see plenty of criticisms, concerns. She's concerned about what's happening in Xinjiang, but she failed to verify the State Department narrative, the Adrian Zenz narrative. She didn't verify any of it. None of it. She didn't verify any of it. So, what does that tell you? That should tell you that these are all lies. What does Michelle Bachelet have to win? She doesn't have nothing to lose. The only reason she was there was because of this propaganda blitz. Why would she go to Xinjiang for any other reason than the fact that every day the United States is in the Western media are talking about human rights violations, genocide, forced labor, detention, etc., etc., etc. But yet, nothing in her statement that says anything related to genocide, anything related to forced labor. That should put all of this to rest. I'm trying to find a guest to talk more about this too. I'm in communication maybe with Daniel Dumbrill, so I hope to get him on. But we got to work that out schedule-wise. He's been there and he has a lot of interesting things to say. So it's all lies, it's all fairy tales, as Big Teal said in the chat. This is having consequences, and so we have to counter it. And we have to call it what it is, lies. Some people have a hard time with that, and I can't stand it. Call it for what it is. It's lies. It's lies. It's lies. It's lies. It's not, there's no, oh, maybe there's a kernel of truth. No. That's just giving in to the establishment narrative. There's no kernel of truth here. If there was, Michelle Bachelet would give you plenty. She would pop that popcorn. She would put those kernels in the fucking pot and pop it. What does she have to lose? Nothing. She has nothing to lose. She could have easily went along with the narrative, but she didn't see no genocide and she didn't see any forced labor. She's not some puppet of China or the Communist Party of China. The United States is a myth-making machine. Its whole foundations is based on myths, American exceptionalism, American innocence, all of it. Freedom, democracy, liberty, etc. Blah, 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 myth. The United States is a big lie. Capitalism, imperialism are big lies because they have to rely on lies to conceal the class character of it all. The fact that it is you, the worker, the oppressed, that's being super exploited. It's you that's being driven into a counterproductive war with a friend. China's a friend. China's a friend of peace, a friend in the climate fight, a friend in our efforts to eliminate and eradicate poverty. You're being duped into going into war with a friend, and a big friend. We're talking about 1.4 billion strong, and you're being duped into believing forced labor. Oh, look at this forced labor. You're being you're believing lies from an incel Christian fundamentalist who, if he were on the Supreme Court, would vote to take away Roe v. Wade. How many liberals have been duped by Adrian Zenz? And this guy is railing against China's contraception policies as genocide. What does that mean for people, for queer people, for women, for trans, for everybody here, when you have Adrian Zenz serving as a spokesperson for anti-China policy? It means that your country's driven and run by evangelical white supremacist terrorists. That's what the United States is run by, evangelical white supremacist terrorists. And some of them call themselves liberals. Some of them call themselves conservatives or Republicans. But that's what they are. Some of them say we're representatives of black people. Some of them say that they're representatives of progressive politics. But they're all white supremacists, imperialists, evangelical terrorists because they do nothing about the biggest threat to peace, the biggest threat to humanity, which is a war on China. That's the biggest threat. You know, it's 1 and 1A. War on Russia, war on China, war on Russia. Those are the biggest threats to humanity. Climate change, oh, that's coming. But I always say to people, there's so many people. I know so many people who are like, and I'm going to end it here. So many people who are like, Danny, climate change. I'm so scared. Climate change. I'm so scared that the earth is going to be ruined. I'm like, I share your anxieties about climate change. I am sad. I mourn about what's happening to the natural world. We need to do something about it. But for damn sure, the threat of nuclear catastrophe is much closer. And they're not, you can't disconnect them. The US is the biggest polluter. Its military is the biggest polluter. You can't disconnect them. Its military is going to get us into a nuclear war far sooner than the planet becoming uninhabitable for humans. And you can't disconnect these issues. You can't. Stop it. Just stop it. But that's liberalism. Liberalism can't see more than one thing, right? Because it's narrow, it's individualist, it's Americanist. They can't see more than one thing, right? There's no peripheral vision, right? There's none. So there you have it. There you have it. I'm going to go, though, because I do have to pick up my pup. I do have to do some things after that. But continue to like this stream. I'm going to check. Before you leave, I'm checking this. Oh, it looks like I have more likes than viewers. That's good. I like that. But if you haven't liked it yet, like the stream. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe to the channel. Hit that notifications bell if you haven't hit it already. And of course, I am just, what is it? 24 subscribers away from 500. And I'd like to get there. And I'll tell you why. Not because I haven't met my goal, because I have. I've met the goal for the monthly amount that I want to be making. But I can tell you truthfully and honestly that come August 1st, once all of that processes, it'll be a lot less. So that's how it works in this. It's kind of like a gig game. So in the description below, you have my Patreon, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can also help out on Substack. Substack also works. I have a new article there I reviewed yesterday in yesterday's stream, which you can check out, Ghost Stories of Capitalism. I'm going to be sharing that tonight, I think, on social media. I have not shared it yet. I've been working and then doing this. This has been, yes, shout out to everyone. Thank you all for making it happen. You know, and I believe that if I go at the pace I'm going and people continue to support, I'll be able to stay there eventually before the new year comes around. Someone wants me to show us a picture of the puppy. I actually have a whole Instagram for him. Yes, I'm one of those folks. So I'm going to put it up actually for all of you. How about that? Right before I go, because I got to go in like 5 minutes. So let me do this really quick. All right. I can do this for all of you. Shout out to everyone. Let's have some fun. All right. So I'll show you. I love him. He's really adjusting well. Really learning. It's been really great. Now I'm working on separation anxiety with them because we haven't been able to leave him alone. Now I'm up to 10 minutes leaving him alone. I'm doing it the right way. I'm trying to be a good dad here. Trying to be a good dad. So here we are. This is my Instagram for him. So there he is. Named him after Eugene Debs. So I named the profile this. I know it's corny. You can follow this too. I'll send it to you all. If you all on Instagram like to mess around, I don't post that often because, as you know, I'm everywhere. But you can follow that. So here we are. There he is. I mean, I love this picture of him. There he is. I hope you can see that. He's very cute. Here I am with him taking a selfie. He is so beautiful. You don't understand. People on the streets will stop me and be like, "That's a beautiful dog." Like, and it's hilarious. You get like mean muggers on the street, just like, smoking. They're like smoking their pot. They're like posting up. They're looking like they're so tough that they got a chip on their shoulders. And then they'll just stop and they'll be like, "He's so beautiful." I had teenagers, you know how it is. I was like this when I was a kid. When I walked down the streets with my friends, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm so tough. I'm so hood, whatever it is," right? I'd be like, that's what you do. Cause if you don't do that, there's this idea that maybe um you'll get punked or something. But I have kids, who are doing that, and then they're just like, "Your dog's so pretty," It's great. Um, Here's a great video I want to show you. This video is really cute. I don't know if I'm. Can you hear that? I don't know if you can hear that, but there he is getting love at daycare because he loves his daycare buddies. As you can see, he's just kissing away. Kissing away. One of the best parts about him is that he loves dogs. And so I'm going to end that there. But one of the best parts about it is that he loves dogs. One of the hardest parts behaviorally, the only part about him behaviorally that's tough, is that he loves dogs so much that he will try to play with every single one. And you know how it is if you have a dog, or if you just know about dogs. Not all dogs like to be played with. So that's a challenge. I'm using a spray bottle now to be humane about it, because he doesn't really respond to it's distracting out there, guys. It's really distracting out there. It's the city. I live in the city. It's distracting. It's hard to train dogs when there's noise and cars and people and dogs. So I've been using a water spray bottle now to distract him and lower his intensity level when he's approaching other dogs. It's actually been kind of working. He doesn't really see it as punishment. He doesn't like it. He's like, "Oh no, oh no." And I don't really enforce it with like sternness. It's just I'm trying to get his association that he should be a little more. He should not be harnessing and focusing all in on another dog. So he like yanks me to the freaking dog, and then the dog is like, "Arr," and it's like a hot mess. So anyway, there you go. You have some insight into my dog life. But I actually have to run out of here right now. So anyway, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. Support this work. It's really much appreciated. About 24 subscribers away from that goal, the subscriber goal of 500, will keep me where I need to be month by month. So take care, everyone. Be well. I'll see you soon, either tomorrow or Saturday. I haven't decided yet. Bye-bye.